Let's take a look at how we evaluate those sources we're working with. What makes them good for our use? How do we tell when they're not the sources we're looking for? So there are all of these sources that we mentioned earlier, including books, articles, websites, videos, and more. How do you figure out which one might be what you need for a particular question? You want to consider three main things. 1, the scope of the article, or how broad the information is. If you're writing a short paper or giving a general overview of a subject, you'll likely want a fairly broad article that also gives general information about the subject. If you're writing a more specific paper and asking a very specific question, you may want sources that are also narrower in scope and look at a small aspect of the larger subject. 2, the depth of the article is often related to its scope. The narrower the scope of information, the more in-depth the authors can get about that information. The broader the scope of the article, the shallower it will need to be about any particular aspect of that subject. 3, the third aspect is how long it takes to publish within that particular format. The time going through the thought of the author to writing the information to publishing it will determine how current or recent the information is. If you're writing about the Roman Empire, it might be fine to use a form that takes a while to publish, because the information we have probably isn't changing rapidly. Conversely, if you're writing about a new form of treatment for a disease, you'll need to use sources that are quicker to publish so it can be more current. That said, there will be times that you need a source that was quick to publish on a more historical source, but you find it very useful. Similarly, a source with a lengthier publication timeline might give you a great overview of a subject, even though you're also going to need more recent sources for recent developments. Here are a few examples of matching sources to your information needs. Books are relatively long, so they may have a lot of information on a subject within them. They could be narrow or broad, depending on the author's intention in writing the book and who it's intended for. It usually takes several years to publish a book. Magazine articles are often pretty narrow in scope because they're relatively short pieces. It can take only days to get a magazine article published, so many of them are very topical to current events. Others might be more historical pieces. This will be determined by what the magazine is and what it's trying to accomplish. Websites can post information extremely quickly, sometimes within minutes of news breaking or someone having a thought. Their scope and depth is entirely dependent on what the website is. Journal articles typically have a very narrow scope, go into great depth about the subject, and can be between months and years to be published. One way that we can think about whether a source meets our needs is how it ended up where it did. Information in the physical world might be printed. That means that it's been written and exists in a physical medium, like a piece of paper. This is different, but not exclusive, from being published. A published work is something that had to go through a process, probably being edited and vetted by people other than the author. Published works may well be in printed form, but the important aspect of them is that they went through that publication process. A printed text may or may not have been published, so we would want to determine what process it went through to end up on that page. Information might be physically printed in a journal, but it could also be physically printed from someone's home printer. That's the physical form of the information. However, scholarly articles go through a peer review process. Books that go through publishing companies are similarly edited, vetted, and ultimately published. The same is not true for someone producing a newsletter from their home as an individual. They may have printed their articles, but the articles did not go through a rigorous publication process. Taking this to the digital world, we can think of this as websites that post material versus ones that publish the material. Anything that ends up on a website has been posted in some way, but we want to know that it went through a process. Someone other than the author read it, edited it, and vetted the quality of the information. As you can see on this slide, that's sometimes the difference between a blog post and a news article. But there are lots of examples of this. It could be a video produced by an individual and posted to YouTube versus an organization that produced a video and vetted it for quality before posting it to YouTube. Information that's printed or posted isn't necessarily bad information, but it does require that you take on more of the burden of determining whether this information is high quality, and it's less likely to be reliable without those processes in place. Consider where the source lives. A source that's on the open web is something that you might find by doing a Google search, and there's often no fee associated with it. Newspapers and journals may be available on the open web, but they do have a fee associated with them often. A Google search can be a great way to find information, but you're going to find a lot of information, and you may find it's like sorting through a huge pile of things. Some of them will be great, but a lot of them will be very low quality and of no value to you. Google's results are arranged by what other people find helpful based on your search, so you may be getting what's popular rather than what's relevant or high quality. Library databases give you free access to paid content like newspapers, trade and scholarly journals, and more. They have a layer of review, as everything had to go through a publication process. There will also be much more original research from scholars, as well as in-depth information. Consider who the information is for. An article for a popular audience is one that's written for people who aren't experts in the field. They may be reading the article just to learn about something they're not familiar with yet because they're interested, or just for fun. To determine if a source is for a popular audience, ask, would the general public read it? Is it interesting to a wide range of people? Can you read it if you're not an expert? Is it general and not detailed? Information for a scholarly audience will be different. You can ask, is it for experts to read? Is it intended to share new and original research or studies? Is it highly specific and detailed? Once you know who the audience is, you'll have a better idea of whether it's a source that's appropriate for your use. There's one test or checklist you can conduct on nearly any source you use, and it will be instructive on its suitability for your use. The criteria are the currency of the source, or how current the material is. You may be fine with or even want an older source, but you'll want to be aware of whether the age works for the subject that you're studying. The second criteria is the relevance of the source to your research question. Sometimes it will be relevant to the whole question, but sometimes it will be relevant to only one aspect of your question. Then you'll need to find additional sources that speak to the other aspects and draw your own conclusion in your paper or project. Next, the authority of the source is who wrote it. What credentials do they have? Can you trust them? What makes them a trustworthy source? Next, accuracy is about how factually correct the information is. Check their sources and verify that their conclusions follow directly from the evidence and that they use sound logic. Finally, ask what the purpose of the source is. Why did they write it? Everyone will have some purpose for creating the information, so don't think that the purpose inherently biases the author too much. But ask, are they trying to get my money or my vote? Are they sharing their work so others can benefit? Why do they want me to believe them? What do they want me to do with this information? Considering their intended audience of the source will help you in determining the purpose of the writing. Then try to ensure that your purpose in reading the source lines up with their purpose in writing it. Academic sources work very well in this case if your purpose is to learn what the current research is, and their purpose is to share their most recent research with you. The final method for evaluating a source is to make sure that you're looking both within a source and learning about the publication, as well as across other sources and from other authors on the same subject. These are called vertical and horizontal reading. While you want to evaluate a source on its own merits, It's also helpful to know what others are saying about the subject, as well as about the source you're using. Look at how the subject has changed over time. What do we know now that we didn't used to know? Now that you've considered the scope, depth, and publication time, and you've learned about distinguishing material that's posted or printed from material that's been published, you've learned to consider the intended audience of the source and how to apply the CRAAP test. And finally, you've considered evaluating sources both within the source and by looking to external sources to learn more. With all of that available to you, you'll be able to comprehensively evaluate whether a source is suitable for your information needs.